this episode 4 of Uncover, we interview one of the NHL Greats. He is an author, Stanley Cup Champion, and global speaker, Theo Fleury. Theo was literally on top of a mountain, so we were only able to capture the audio. Nonetheless, this episode was a hat trick. Pay attention and take notes, or you will be checked into the boards. Your host, as usual, will be Jasmine Sandler, center for her hockey team. Bet you didn't know that. Okay, face off!
Everyone, welcome to today's Uncover podcast, episode number 4. I am absolutely thrilled, beyond belief, actually, to interview today's guest, Theo Fleury. Most people know I'm a huge hockey fan, so I'm just so appreciative to have some of Theo's time today. He is an NHL Stanley Cup champion. For those of you out there that watch hockey, who now will. And I'm going to give a little bit of background about Theo, and then we're going to jump right into it. I mentioned is a Stanley Cup champion, one of my role models in hockey. He's an Olympic gold medalist, a World Cup junior champion, and expert in the field of relational trauma, which is really what we're going to talk about today. Theo's known, obviously, for his success on the ice, but we're going to talk about what he's done to help people off the ice today. And in a world that's changing and troubled, I'm thrilled to have him on. His life once carried markings of child abuse, and I don't know how much he's going to share today, but he's certainly going to share how he helps people through both the written word and the spoken word. He is the author of 2 best-selling books, Playing with Fire and Conversations with a Rattlesnake, both of which I've just started to read. So hopefully when we have him on the show again, I'll be done with those books. And, you know, he encourages open sharing and provides practical tools to people that are seeking help out there and really are having a tough Today, Theo is a healthy, inspirational agent of change, which we surely need today. And he is a global speaker, and his highly acclaimed speaking engagements are on the subjects of trauma abuse, and he invites the audience to engage through reflection to create a safe environment, which is just critical to overcome those types of challenges. So that was a long-winded intro. Welcome, Theo, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jasmine.
You're welcome. So I'd like to start with, of course, a question that myself and all my hockey fans, we want to understand, and also a question that I think will help to give the entrepreneurs and executives out there some advice on how to make it today when we're in such a saturated world. So if you wouldn't mind starting, Theo, with how you made it in the NHL, if you don't mind starting with that, like how you became, you know, what we call a superstar in the NHL, what maybe you went through and how you got there and how you achieved your goal and your vision.
Yeah. Well, I was going to kindergarten in a very small town in Canada. The town is called Binscarth, population 300 people. And I was walking home with a classmate of mine from school one day, and he said to me, you know, we're having our first hockey practice tonight. Would you like to play? And so I quickly ran home, asked my mom if I had any equipment or anything. So we searched around the house, and I found an old pair of skates that were 2 or 3 sizes too big, a broken hockey stick, some old hockey gloves, and you know, a couple of retail catalogs that I used, you know, for shin pads. And you know, I put all this stuff in a pillow sack, and I went to my first hockey practice. And you know, when we try something new for the first time, you know, we usually struggle, or it takes practice, it takes hard work, it takes dedication, all those things. But, you know, my experience that day at the rink was I put all that gear on, and I stepped on the ice, and I didn't fall down, and I didn't struggle, and I absolutely fell head over heels in love with the game of hockey. And I knew from a very young age that that is what I wanted to do, and that's what I wanted to make my profession. And so most of my childhood, I was very focused on becoming a hockey player, which meant that I lived, I ate, I drank, I slept hockey, and my mom often said to me that she was just going to move my bed to the rink because that's where I spent the majority of my time as a kid, and not only that, I had three incredible coaches and fathers that taught me some really incredible core values that I hold very near and dear to my heart. I think the reason why we put our kids in sports is not for them to become, professional athletes. I think we put them in sports so that they, learn these core values that become, incredibly important as they, move up in the world, and then as they become adults and try to find jobs and all of that. So, I was very fortunate. I was very lucky to have, this kind of mentorship at a very young age. And yeah, it was just lots of years of practice. It's the old Malcolm Gladwell theory of,
Right.
10,000 hours. And by the time I was, 15 years old, I had already put in those 10,000 hours. And at 15, I moved away from home and because, I grew up very poor. I grew up where both my parents struggled with their own trauma issues from their childhood, which manifests itself into addictions. And I wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. And so at 15, I moved away from home and went on to pursue this dream that I had, and got drafted by the Calgary Flames in 1987, and 1989 I made it to the NHL, and that year won a Stanley Cup. And so all that hard work and dedication and practice and travel and all those things finally came true and finally came to fruition. And it was an amazing career, and I was very lucky and very fortunate to be able to do something that I love to do for 15 years. And yeah, I had an amazing hockey career and was a part of a lot of championship teams, and it was an amazing experience. And people often say, was it everything you thought it would be? And it was everything in that and more. And and then getting the opportunity to play in New York, was an incredible experience as well. And going to Madison Square Garden every night and playing, and as you walk into the Garden, you see all the amazing people that have showcased their amazing talents, not only on the ice, but
Right.
whether it was Muhammad Ali boxing or the many musical acts that have played there. So it was a huge thrill, and I was very, very blessed and fortunate to not only have the career that I had, but I also played with some incredible people as well, from Lanny McDonald in Calgary to Joe Sakic in Colorado, and Jerome McGinley and Messier and Gretzky and Yzerman and Mario Lemieux, and the list just goes on and on and on. So and I learned a lot from those guys about leadership and being humble and having respect and yeah. So it was, like I said, it was an amazing career.
Well, I can't imagine, but it is amazing. And what's funny is, so I'm also a big boxing fan, and I don't know if you've seen or read about, read the Mike Tyson story, but it's actually similar to his story. He had a very rough childhood, and he found a mentor who kind of saved him, but he also had that discipline, Theo, that you're talking about. I mean, yes, everybody knows that 10,000 hours, but I think doing 10,000 hours means you have to say no to so many other things in life, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's
right. And so can you tell us how'd you do that? How did you say no to things?
well, the last place I wanted to be was at home, right? Because my home was very chaotic and volatile, and my mom suffered from depression, and my dad was drinking most of the time, and so the last place I wanted to be was at home, and so the rink or the school gym or anywhere but home is where I wanted to be, and I didn't realize at the time that I was putting in 10,000 hours. I was just doing the best that I could to not be around that situation as much as possible.
Right. So talk a little bit about, during that time, because it's a long career, were there times where you struggled or got down on yourself or were frustrated with things? I mean, I'm sure there were. And how did you get past those things?
Well, I think at the end of the day, I had sort of this God-given talent and ability that that allowed me to do the things that I did on the ice. But away from the rink, I I struggled with a lot of the emotional pain and scars that were left behind from it, from being around my parents. And then I was sexually abused for 2 years by a coach. I was raped 150 times by this guy, and so there was all of this emotional pain that I could deal with when I was on the ice, but when I left the rink, it was really hard for me to be alone, and so I coped and sort of managed through that, and I got involved in addictions and drank a lot at the beginning, and then as um, as the pain sort of got worse, and I wasn't seeking help, and I was just trying to manage it all on my own. I got involved in some street drugs, and so cocaine and vodka sort of became my Paxil and Prozac and Zoloft. That I was able to sort of manage the pain for the most part, but when you add a substance like cocaine to your addiction, it's a pretty fast trip to the bottom of the gutter. And I said it in the book. I went to New York to take a bite out of the Big Apple, but it took a huge bite out of me, and struggled for many years with depression and anxiety and panic disorder and you name it. And in 2005, September 18th of 2005, after a failed suicide attempt, I had a fully loaded pistol in my mouth, ready to pull the trigger. Not because I wanted to die, but I was completely exhausted from living in emotional pain and suffering, and I had tried everything on the planet to get rid of this pain, and and thank God I didn't pull the trigger, and that was sort of the start of this new life that I have, and I can tell you that it's been a long, hard road back, but it's definitely a road worth taking, and now I have the opportunity to help so many other people from all of the experiences that I've had throughout my life.
Wow. Well, first of all, honestly, thank you so much for sharing that. I don't think most people have the balls to do that, Theo.
Well, thank you.
No, I'm a dead serious person, and most people have struggles and they go through pain and they go through things and they take things, but you can't see it. So it's just refreshing. So, I would love to hear about what you're doing now in terms of how you're helping people, and specifically, how are you helping people that have a tough time either letting go of those addictions or opening up? Can you talk about that?
Yeah. You know, I retired from hockey in 2003 and went through a really difficult time because I had no idea what the rest of my life was going to look like. You know, I'd focused pretty much all of my energy and attention to becoming this hockey player that, you know, I didn't have a plan B when I retired. And so, you know, I went through a difficult time, probably 4 or 5 years trying to get my proverbial shit together, you know, you know, a chance meeting at a Flames alumni golf tournament. I ran into an old media guy that used to cover the Flames. And, you know, the first question he asked me, he said, what are you doing these days? I said, I'm doing absolutely nothing. And so we sort of went back and forth, you know, small talk here and there. And, you know, to this day, I really don't know why I asked them this question, but I said, you know, do you know anybody that would be interested in writing a book with me? And he said, funny you should ask. He said, my wife is a writer. I was like, okay, perfect. And so I met with her 3 days after that conversation. And then 3 days after that, Kirsty and I started writing Playing with Fire. And, you know, there was no way, shape, or form that I was going to talk about sexual abuse or trauma or addiction or any of that. I was just going to talk about my hockey career. And, you know, as the process of writing the book started, you know, Kirsty gained my trust. And so we started sort of peeling the layers of the onion off, so to speak. And you know, 3 years later, we have this book, Playing with Fire. And I didn't leave anything out. You know, I told the whole entire story. So 4 days before I'm going to Toronto to launch this book, like I'm shitting in my pants because I'm going, you know, what have I done here? You know,
Right. Exposing it, right?
yeah, and I was like, I was scared, I was anxious, you know, all these things, and also I knew that I was going to go do a whole bunch of media around this book, and I knew that they were only going to focus on one thing, and that was, you know, my sexual abuse. And I knew that they were going to try to re-traumatize me at every opportunity, right?
Mm-hmm.
But because I'm a very smart, bright guy, I spent those 4 days on my computer researching everything that I could find on the subject of child sexual abuse so that, you know, when I went into the interviews, like every good politician, you never have to answer the reporter's question directly. And so I wanted to have 5 main points in these interviews because I wanted to get a story of hope and healing and recovery and, you know, positive stuff, not
Yep.
all negative and, you know, the way that the media usually covers stuff. And so sure enough, I went to Toronto. I did probably 300 interviews in 5 days. And like I said, every interviewer wanted to, you know, know the gory details of my abuse. But,
Right.
you know, like I said, you know, I was able and managed to get this story of hope and healing and recovery and, you know, all positive stuff. So now I go to the first book signing at the biggest Indigo chapter store in all of Canada in downtown Toronto. And, you know, I didn't have a whole lot of expectations for the book. I didn't think anybody would read it. And so I show up at this book signing. And as I walk into the bookstore, there are 400 people standing in line. And I'm like,
Wow.
this is weird. Like, what are all these people doing here, you know? And so I start signing books, and out of the corner of my eye, spot a guy in line. And he's got my book clutched against his chest, and his face is buried in the floor, and he's walking really slow. And I'm like, you know, I wonder what's up with that guy. So I follow him all the way in the line. He gets to the front of the line. He puts the book on the table. He looks me in the eye and says, "Me too."
Wow.
And that's when I knew what the rest of my life was going to look like. And you know, since that first Me Too, which was 2009, you know, we've had over 600,000 people either directly or indirectly, you know, say those two words. And you know, I call it the power of Me Too. So it doesn't matter, you know, what you've experienced or what you've gone through or what you've suffered through. There's always another human being who's had the same experience as you, and maybe both of you have been scared or leery or whatever it is. But you know, if you can find the courage and you can find the strength, and you know what that guy showed me that day was probably the greatest act of courage I'd ever seen in my life. And you know, all he did was read my book, and I went, interesting that because I found my voice and was able to tell my story honestly, vulnerably, open, that it gave this guy the courage to get to the book signing, because he was carrying a spiritual message of two words, you know, and like I said, not only did it change his life, it changed my life too, because as much as he needed to say it, I needed to hear it as well.
Absolutely.
And you know, sometimes we make life a little bit too complicated when it comes to dealing with our trauma. And you know, that small, or I would say huge act of courage, which I witnessed in front of my eyes, was the catalyst for everything that's happened since, and everything that's going to happen in the future as well.
You know, it's funny that you say that, Me Too, because I think it's funny in business, right? You know, business people in some sense have to act because a lot of times they have to mask what is probably trauma in their lives, whether, right? Am I right? And whether it's, I mean, believe me, Theo, we could talk for hours about trauma, but
Yeah.
so whether it's small trauma or large trauma, it really doesn't matter. And you know, a lot of times people get stuck and they can't get past things and they don't know why. And I really love what you said about this Me Too, because to me it illustrates the openness to talk and be brave about things, because I think a lot of people go around with things in their heads, right? And they cycle and they circle, and it turns into manifests into what you were talking about, like panic and anxiety and drugs and right? So
Yeah.
I wonder if there are any tips you could share to others that are maybe going through things, whether they're aware of those things or they're blind to them.
Right.
Some tips that you might want to share to some people. Maybe they're outwardly in pain, or maybe they don't know but they're stuck. Are there any tips that you can share from your personal experience?
Mm-hmm. Well, as a person who struggled for many, many years, right? I think both you and I grew up in the tough love world, right?
Oh yeah.
Where, you know, suck it up, suck it up, suck it up. Well, you know, I think the more you suck it up, the more problems you're going to have, right?
Yep.
And so the best advice that I can give is, you know, find a safe person. Find somebody who has compassion, you know, and you know, sit in front of them and explain what happened to you, because I think, you know, there's a great saying in 12-step: you're only as sick as your secrets. Well, guess what? I had a lot of secrets, and I was really sick, emotionally, physically, spiritually, you name it. I was sick because I was carrying all this stuff around with me, and I couldn't make sense of it. Right? You know, how do you make sense of, you know, a coach raping you 3 times a week? Like, how do you make sense of that? You know, or how do you live with the aftermath of what that does to you? and not only that, you know, my parents' constant arguing and fighting and you know, just chaos.
Right.
How do you make sense of that when you're a young person? Well, as you get older, you know, and you become more mature and you become more attuned to, you know, what's going on with you. There comes a point in your life, and I call that, you know, the proverbial rock bottom, where, you know, you have to make a choice. Am I going to die or am I going to live? And not commit suicide die. I mean, just die, you know,
Yeah,
like
right.
slow, painful, lonely, miserable, angry, you know, death. Because
Yeah.
that's what happens to us, right? Is that we feel that there's no safe place for us to go and, you know, reveal all this stuff that happened to us. But in my experience, we're not in the minority. We're in the majority,
Mm.
right? The
Yeah.
majority of us have experienced the same kind of trauma I'm talking to you about.
Absolutely.
And it isn't until you come to that realization that if I don't get this stuff off my chest, I'm going to die. And for me, that moment, you know, when I had the gun in my mouth and I'm, you know, a millisecond away from pulling the trigger, and then all of a sudden something snapped in my head that said, you know, you've never quit anything in your life. Why are you quitting now? You know, and that allowed me to take the gun and throw it into the desert. And
Mm.
I had two choices. Was I going to die or was I going to live? And I chose to live, but guess what? I have no clue how to live life on life's terms, you know? And so, uh, you know, I have to go on this mission of self-discovery, right?
Yep.
And, you know, the first thing I had to do was forgive myself, you know?
Mm.
And you know, when I started to do that, then, you know, then I gotta love myself, right? I
Yep.
gotta learn how to love myself, because
Absolutely.
if I don't love myself, I can't be in a relationship with anybody else
That's
and
right.
love them, right? You know, that's why, you know, the divorce rates are at the highest we've ever seen in the history of mankind. Why? Because most people uh, don't feel good about themselves. You know, like
Yeah.
we feel not good enough. We don't feel lovable. You know, and so if you don't go through the process of forgiving yourself, loving yourself, and then once you do those two things, guess what? It teaches you about humility, right?
Yeah. That's right.
And
Because that ego can be a mask, right?
oh, it is. That's all it is.
Yeah.
And then once you get to humility, then it pushes you right into compassion,
Mm.
where we all need to be as human beings. Is we all need to have compassion for one another, because, you know, we all got stuff and we all have trauma, and if we aren't putting ourselves in a position of helping others get through their traumatic experiences, then the cycle never stops and the cycle will always continue, right?
Yes. Well, you know, I think what you're doing is huge, because I was listening to you and I was thinking about how, you know, little things eventually become big things, right? You know what I'm talking
Yes,
about.
absolutely.
So, right? I mean, you look at the world today and how systems are broken, and I try not to listen to anything anymore because it's so depressing about
Right.
Korea's going to push a button and all these insane things.
Yeah.
But what you're talking about typifies that, because it sounds like, you know, if people are unhappy, then what are they going to do? They're just going to shove that off on someone else. They don't know how to deal with it. It's going to lead to groups of hate,
Yeah.
you know, segregation, all of these things. And I love what you're talking about. Your message is so important, you know, it's just so important so that the system doesn't keep getting broken, right?
Yeah. Because trauma is at the core of every single issue we have in society,
Mm,
right? Like
yeah.
you mentioned North Korea. You don't think that Kim Jong Un is not Traumatized?
Oh, he looks traumatized.
You know
No,
what I
it's
mean?
true.
Living in that.
That was part one. Very inspirational and eye-opening. Make sure to catch part two. If you enjoyed this podcast, and I know that you did, please hit subscribe on iTunes and on YouTube. You can also support us through Patreon and becoming a board member. As a board member, you will get early access to episodes, top 5 lists from our guests, as well as various action plans, such as action plans for personal branding online, LinkedIn marketing, and much, much more.